What is up, F1 fans? My name is Chris,
And my name is James.
and we are the Formula One Bros.
Just two twins with a love of F1 to share our thoughts on everything in the world of Formula One. And I have to say, it is so good to be back. It's been a couple of weeks, couple of episodes without me in it. My crazy work schedule here at the end of the school year, being a school teacher, but I am back. And I'm so excited to be back to talk about a pretty good Emilia Romagna Grand Prix.
Yeah, it was good. Well, first of all, welcome back. It's been nice kind of doing the podcast solo, but it's definitely not the same. So I'm glad to have you back and welcome back. And it's good and just in time to talk about a great 2024 Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. So why don't you just kind of give us our overall thoughts on the race?
Yeah, so we'll talk about all of these topics in depth a little bit more, but a couple of things. It was a pretty boring race for the first like 2/3 of the race, but the last third was like very exciting. Lando Norris looked really quick, and it was really cool to see him. And I think within a couple of laps, I think he could have passed Max. The fact that Red Bull, this was not a great weekend for Red Bull. Yes, Max won the race, but it was overall was not a good weekend for Red Bull. And the fact that Max still won, even though his car was, he's been struggling with his car all weekend long, just goes to show the type of champion that he is. Ferrari, some questions here or there about why Ferrari chose to do their strategy the way that they did, but Ferrari and McLaren look like they've definitely closed the gap to Red Bull. Red Bull looked beatable. So yeah, I thought it was a pretty good race. It's exciting to see that the gap from the top three is getting so much closer to Red Bull. And it's going to make a very interesting middle and end of the season, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think I mentioned this on the preview episode that it kind of seems like we're trending towards this kind of like really tight top three group and then everybody else below.
Yeah.
Which I think was pretty much confirmed this week. It's one of the things that I think, kind of proved to be true with all of the upgrades being present on all of the cars now. Yeah, it was really interesting. The Red Bull pace deficit, as I mentioned, I think in a previous episode, when comparing, Sergio Perez to Alex Albon and that second car, Alex Albon in a podcast said a statement where the gap is always comparing himself and Sergio Perez 3-4 tenths.
Mm-hmm.
And when and Alex said when he was in the car, when they were not at that dominant level, that 2022, 2023 level, that 2 to 3 tenths per lap puts him, between fifth and eighth.
Mm-hmm.
And, with Sergio Perez, at the beginning of the season, that gap was good enough to put him second or third. But now that I think the top three are getting a lot closer, I think that we're starting to see that 2 to 3 tenths second gap. There's a lot more cars occupying that space now, where Sergio Perez is just off by a little bit in qualifying and he leaves it all to do in the race, and it compromises his race. This is a trend that we saw last year, and this is exactly what happened. He qualified P11 for the race, and he recovered up to eighth, which is great. But he left it all to do, and on a track like Imola, that pretty much, your Sunday is pretty much over before it begins. So I also will say on the Red Bull front, it kind of seems like they were really struggling on the hard tires at the end of the stints. And unfortunately Sergio Perez got the short end of that stick because he was stuck on the hards initially and had to go long. He made up a lot of ground on the mediums in his second stint, but he was getting overtaken left and right. And I think that was, just a result of not being able to manage the hard tires as good as I think they were expecting to.
Yeah.
Lando's engineer did come over the radio and say that everybody was struggling with that degradation was a little bit higher, but I think particularly it hit the Red Bulls hard on the hard tires particularly. So that was interesting to see. Another thing is, I think we were talking about Lando, and I mentioned after the Miami, at Miami race that he was quick. He won that on merit, but he was aided by the safety car. I still think had that safety car not happened in Miami, he would have been able to fight for the win. And the results today were definitive of that, definitive proof that despite not having a safety car, having to actually play the strategy out on the track, not getting help with anything in terms of, a safety car, a virtual safety car, some sort of race neutralization, he was able to still take the fight to Red Bull. And, those closing laps were really intense. I think the only thing that happened, I think it was lap like 59, 58, something, where he just had a really scruffy lap. And I think he overworked the tires and that compromised him to the end for the last like 3 or 4 laps. But it was really good. Oscar Piastri ended up faster than Sainz and was putting the pressure on Ferrari all race. So I think, yeah, that's definitive. I think, to me, confirmation that McLaren's upgrades definitely work and are putting them in the win conversation.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I have to, one thing I mentioned earlier, kind of going back to Red Bull. The fact I was very impressed by Max's drive. It's hard to be impressed when the car is just so good and they can manage and still win by 30 seconds, like we saw last year a lot. But this one was really impressive because they've been both drivers had been battling that car all weekend long. I don't think they set fastest lap except for, Max putting it on pole and qualifying. It was either Ferrari and McLaren that was leading in the practice sessions. And Max knew he got off to an early lead and he knew he was going to have to manage the tires. And he did that really, really well. And when Lando started closing the gap, Max's lap time started going up. So even though he was suffering from tire degradation, he saved him enough, knowing he was thinking several steps ahead, knowing that he was going to have to save those tires because he was going to need them at the end. And he made it work. He stayed cool and calm under pressure with Lando Norris breathing down his neck the last several laps. And was able to go on and win the race. I was very impressed. And that I texted you after the race. I'm like, this is a race. This is why Max has been champion for 3 years.
Yeah. I mean,
because he tried like this.
That knowledge of how to manage, even when you're on a tire disadvantage, how to manage and still be able to pull out a couple tenths here or there, or, improve the lap time to keep that cushion of a gap behind you. That's what makes race winners. And that's what separates, race winners from not race winners. Not to say that Lando Norris is not, capable of winning races, because he clearly is now. And I think he is at the end of the day going to be regarded as one of the best drivers this season. But yeah, I think that definitely separates that. So we've talked a little bit about Red Bull, a little bit about McLaren. Let's talk about Ferrari, because they came into the weekend fastest in FP1, fastest in FP2, and then they were really quick on Friday, but struggled on Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah, so I was disappointed by qualifying, but I was encouraged. Even though I was disappointed by qualifying, I was encouraged because their race pace simulations had been really good in practice, and I think their strategy, classic Ferrari, their strategy kind of screwed them in the race. Because I think and we talked about this a little bit before, but and you mentioned that they were playing the strategy as if there was going to be a safety car,
right?
Because there had been a safety car every single race that we had raced at Imola since coming back in 2020?
Yeah.
There had been a safety car in every single race. So for the past 4 seasons, there had been a safety car. But this one there wasn't. And I think they were trying to anticipate there being a safety car a little bit, instead of anticipating the situation that was right in front of them and trying to play the strategy that was in front of them.
Right.
And so I think that screwed them just a little bit. So I think had they done better with their strategy, I think Charles would have been right there in the mix with at the end as well.
Yeah. And to sort of clarify that statement, the reason why I said that and I thought they were playing to a safety car is Imola is not a track that, you can mitigate. Well, the overcut at Imola does not work.
Yeah.
It's a track that is so heavy on the tires that even that one lap undercut of a tire advantage gave Oscar Piastri 1.5 second gap over Carlos Sainz in the pit stops. So,
Mm-hmm.
Oscar Piastri went into the pits behind Carlos Sainz and when all was said and done, Carlos Sainz was not even in DRS range of Oscar Piastri. So the overcut just doesn't work at Imola. And all teams should have known that going in. They would have done countless simulations. They've been to the track before. They go over strategy numerous times. And I just don't think that for them going long was the right strategy at all. And I think if they wanted to keep McLaren in check and manage that, they should have gone for the undercut. And I think that would have put Charles in a little bit closer touching distance to Lando Norris, unless they thought that the 2-lap tire advantage for them would have kind of mitigated that gap at the very end.
They could also been playing that too. Yeah.
Which is possible, but the only reason I think at Imola you're thinking about going long is in the event that there's a safety car. And I just, I just don't know that that's the right. I don't know that that's the right strategy call. You kind of got to read the race forward and just kind of make the best decision you can, not think about variables. And I think that's something that, had there been a safety car, I think, hindsight is 2020. Had there been a safety car, Ferrari would have looked like geniuses, and they probably would have been competing for, double podium and a win. But, it didn't roll their way. Hindsight's 2020, but I think, it was McLaren. I'm hesitant to say that, McLaren was definitely faster than Ferrari this weekend. I'm hesitant to say that that's going to be something that's going to be a real big trend because, I think McLaren is still a little bit more circuit specific. And I don't think we're going to really find out until we get to Spain after Monaco.
Mm-hmm.
I think they still are a little bit, track specific, but, I think they just didn't play that strategy right at all.
Yeah.
Charles Leclerc was in the closing laps was closing up to Lando Norris, and Lando Norris was closing up to Max Verstappen. So it looked like there was going to be a 3-way battle for the lead towards the end. And then Leclerc went off. Was that the Villeneuve? No, it was the Variante Alta chicane.
Yeah, that one at the top of the hill.
Just went off, and I think since then he wasn't able to recover.
Yeah,
and
kind of dusted his tires a little bit.
Yeah, just it was kind of like Lando did one simple mistake, and it just with old tires it compromised the end of his race. So he was just kind of forced to manage from there on out, and wasn't really able to make an impression. But it's still good. It's still Ferrari's first podium at Imola since coming back, and Ferrari's first podium since 2006, Michael Schumacher. Which the Tifosi were very pleased about. I think Charles probably less so, considering they had really good pace, and again, it's one of those things at this track. They compromised. They compromised their qualifying. They didn't do a really good job, and then they weren't really. It was kind of the day was kind of over. Unless after lap 1 they kind of settled into where they were. They were forced into a management position and trying to fight with McLaren. I don't think that they were really going to be a shot to win unless, something really wrong went with Red Bull. And Red Bull's pace was a little surprising.
Yes,
it's one of those
definitely
things,
so.
It was a perfect crescendo for Max Verstappen. They were struggling on Friday. They between Friday and Saturday, I think Sebastian Buemi back at the factory put in something like 11 hours of work on the simulator, getting the setup right. And, it culminated in, good FP3 and And Max was fastest at exactly the right time, which was Q3. He did everything right and got the setup right and ended up winning the race. So, I think and that's just a testament to how good that team still is. Despite everything that's going on with Red Bull, that is a testament to how good that team is, and it is going to take a lot for a team like McLaren or a team like Ferrari to knock them off the top.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, Red Bull are still the team to beat by a long shot. And this weekend, I also mentioned something. This weekend, McLaren looked faster, but I don't think at this point they're faster than Ferrari. I think you're right when you mentioned that their car is a little bit more track specific. So,
and you could say the same about Ferrari too, but
yeah,
it just doesn't. Neither of those teams have the overall wide working range that the Red Bull car has. To be, I think, be consistent enough to fight for a championship, which is why I'm still fairly confident that Red Bull is going to be in that championship, is going to be at the head of that championship battle all the way down to Abu Dhabi. Of course, it's still early days. Further on down the field,
like, what, 18 laps or 18 races.
Yeah, something like that.
But what am I talking about?
Further on down the field, Mercedes looked like they were the fourth fastest team coming home. Their pace, I was actually really, pleasantly surprised that it seemed like they had a really good, I think that, where they're at is, where they finished was probably the max that they could have done. But, I'm encouraged that, it looks like they were, I don't think they were really in the mix for wins, but I think, they were able to put some pressure.
Yeah. And they, for a while, I mean, they had a pretty boring race, just George and Lewis pretty much on their own little island, pretty much the entire race. But yeah, I think it has been an improvement. It's good to see them at least seem like they were a little bit more consistent this weekend, with both of them kind of finishing in roughly the same area. Not terrible, but not great either. But it looks like they have made some improvement. So,
yeah. And on the kind of same train of talking about Mercedes power cars, Aston Martin had a lot of upgrades, and it looked like they went backwards again. So there's clearly, I think now, given the performance that they had this weekend with all the upgrades that they had, I think I'm pretty confident in saying there's something in their development pipeline that is holding them back, and that is preventing them from moving forward, and even, helping them kind of move backwards a little bit, in terms of relative pace to the rest of the field. But yeah, I mean, just kind of a disappointing weekend for them, I'd say.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like Ferrari in like 2019, 2020, even 2021 a little bit, when they would like bring upgrades, but it was kind of like holding, they're like something wasn't correlating. So it kind of reminded me of that. I have to say, Yuki Tsunoda had a great weekend.
Yeah.
Yuki Tsunoda had a great weekend. He kind of had an anonymous race, but man, he was putting in some quick laps during practice. And where did he end up qualifying? He qualified pretty high up there, didn't he?
I want to say it was like 7th or 8th.
Let me go check the internet. Yeah, but he had a really great weekend. Looked really quick in all the practice sessions. Like, he got third in FP2. He was FP3 qualifying. He qualified 10th. He qualified 10th.
Yeah.
And then he ended, I want to say ended 8th.
Yeah, but that's like what, 3 Q3 appearances in a row.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been super consistent, and it is very safe to say that I think he has been getting the max out of that RB car, and I think that it's a performance so far this season, and with how consistent and how good he's been, that I don't think Red Bull were expecting really at all. He's been so good,
Yeah.
and two really good point scoring weekends back to back, and just doing really good stuff. So Yuki
All right,
Tsunoda
he
continues to
qualified
impress.
7th.
Yeah.
Qualified 7th, finished 10th.
Yep. So, it continues the points haul for RB doing the heavy lifting. Daniel Ricciardo, it looked like he had a little bit better of a race than he did in Miami. Of course, he had a really fantastic sprint race in Miami, but
Yeah.
but
I think he's
not such a great race in Miami. I think he bounced back a little bit but still not quite at that Yuki Tsunoda level.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to chalk that up, at least to right now, that being it, like still kind of him getting his footing back in the car after being away from Formula One for a season. But yeah, Daniel Ricciardo's starting to get a little bit more consistency, and everything, which is good to see. But yeah, pretty decent weekend for RB. They should be pretty happy. Abysmal weekend for Mercedes or for Williams.
Yeah, well, I mean, they were struggling for pace. I mean, Williams is really good at the high speed tracks. They're gonna. I think when they rock up to Monza, I think they're gonna be great. Belgium, they're gonna be great.
Yeah.
Some of those more high speed, low downforce. They kind of like 22 and 23 McLaren just really struggle at the high downforce, low speed corner tracks, and this was the same for them. Of course, I think Alex Albon, just the receiver on the really receiving end of some really poor luck with the wheel not being tightened, forcing him to come back again, and then another penalty, and then that because of their tire allocation, they had to come in and pit again. He was on the mediums, and he was going to have to take mediums like 40 laps to the end of the race, and
I think
ended up.
He was managing like a power unit issue too, I think.
I don't think he was managing something. I think his retirement was the result of wanting to save mileage on the car. And going into the remainder of the European season, as the temperatures start to get hotter, reliability becomes much more a factor with how finicky these power units are and how complex they are. To me, his retirement was one out of necessity. They knew that they weren't going to be in touching distance after that 10-second penalty, which he served on the subsequent pit stop. But he wasn't making any impressions, and so they just decided to retire the car. And Logan Sargent, also just another rough weekend for him. But again, I think that's just a Williams not working on this type of circuit.
Who am I thinking of that I was managing a power unit issue? Maybe I was thinking of Fernando Alonso. There was someone with a Mercedes powered car that was managing a power unit issue.
I don't think that there were any. I don't think there were any issues. But I will say Alpine looked a little bit more competitive. They've been on a very slowly upward trend, and it was another good, consistent weekend. Not a point scoring weekend for them, but they were in the mix in the midfield, much more than they were at the beginning of the season.
This season's been a slow burn at the start. A good burn, but a slow burn at the start. So I think they will look. It looked abysmal during winter testing, first race, but they're starting to pick up a little headway. So
yeah, if I'm going to take a stab at what I think, not the running order, obviously not the Constructors Championship, but in terms of speed, I think Red Bull is still first. I think Ferrari and McLaren are close, tied for second. I give the edge slightly to McLaren just based off of the past 2 weekends. I think we need a little bit more sample size to really kind of start to suss out the gap between those two. But I think it's Red Bull, McLaren and Ferrari, Mercedes. I think RB is 5th fastest. And then I think at that top of the midfield, I think Haas is now in striking distance to Aston Martin. And the Haas look, I'm still going to give the edge a little bit to Aston Martin just because Lance Stroll was able to eke out a point this weekend, or 2 points this weekend, finishing 9th. But, Nico Hulkenberg putting in Q3 was at one point like 3rd fastest in qualifying or something ridiculous. He continues to deliver for that team. And I think right now the thing that's holding them back is Kevin Magnussen. So that'll be interesting to see if Haas go for somebody else other than Kevin Magnussen. But Nico Hulkenberg continues to deliver. And I think they're at the sharp end of that midfield with Aston Martin. And then going further on down, I would probably say, Alpine, Sauber, and Williams are right there. I think Alpine is starting to kind of leapfrog those ahead. They've definitely leapfrogged Williams, and I think they're now starting to leapfrog kick Sauber F1. And I think Williams is right down there at the bottom end. But the thing that I will say is, even despite that, the grid is closer than ever.
Oh yeah.
It's still like, I remember, what was it in 2014, the Chinese Grand Prix there, or the Canadian Grand Prix, one of the early Grand Prix, where there was like a second and a half between first and sixth or seventh.
That was
in
China
qualifying in qualifying. Well, I'm thinking of even earlier than that.
Oh, gotcha.
But now there's maybe a second and a half between down the entire grid.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. It is getting a lot closer. It is getting a lot more competitive, and I think it swings track to track on who's going to be where. But I think just based on averages, I think I would say that's probably about where we're at now.
Yeah, and I would say for this weekend, granted, it's Imola is a track that it's really hard to pass and it's really hard to overtake. But we didn't see a whole lot of overtaking in this race. But I think these cars, with the new regulations, they're definitely allowing for a lot closer racing, which is good. I think we'll still see the cars being very, still being less. I don't think we'll see the racing be any closer than it is right now, at least until we get the new aero regulations in 2026, yep. With the cars being a lot smaller. Because right now the cars are just big
and heavy.
They're just big and heavy, and they look just they just look they don't look very light and nimble.
Yeah.
And looking at the aero regulations for 2026, that is the year 2026, right? When they're
yep.
So I think that is when we'll start seeing a lot better racing, because they'll be a lot smaller. It'll kind of be roughly similar to the size of like the mid 2000s.
Yeah. So I definitely agree. That it's just a tough track, and then we're going. Next weekend we're going to Monaco, which is going to be another one of those where qualifying is all important. So that'll be interesting to see. But all in all, a pretty okay race. I mean, you're only going to get but so much action at Imola, and then Monaco, same thing. I think the only reason why the 2023 race was really good, because we had that rain and the Ferrari strategy was all messed up, and kind of resulted in the Max Verstappen win. But I think again we'll really start to kind of see some really, really amped up good racing when we start to get into the meat of the European season. I'm thinking, when we go to Spain, when we go to Canada, when we go to Austria,
England,
those, UK, those tracks, when we get into June and July, I think that's when all that's going to pick up. It's just tough, but it's good to be back at Imola after a year's absence because of the canceled race last year because of the flooding. So it was just good to be back. It's good to see Ferrari on an Italian podium again.
Yes, it is so nice.
Which is fantastic. Would have loved for it to be the top step, but there's still a lot of racing to happen.
I'll take a podium.
So going forward, I'm really excited because next weekend, not only is next weekend the Monaco Grand Prix, but if you are one of if you're one of our racing fans in the United States, it is one of the best. It is the best day in motorsports in the entire calendar year. You have the Monaco Grand Prix, which is exciting because of the glitz and glam, but the action for that really starts on Saturday. But then you immediately turn it over to the Indianapolis 500, and then you immediately turn that over to the Coke 600, which is always a really good race. Charlotte is an incredible track, and I've been wanting to go for a while. We don't live too far from Charlotte, so
one of these days we'll make it to the Coke 600.
Yeah, so it's going to be great. Looking ahead in the world of Formula One, just kind of keeping on updates. There was some news kind of heading into the weekend that Adrian Newey had mentioned and made comments in just kind of in passing that he definitely looking to stay on the Formula One grid.
Yeah,
So,
he even confirmed that he was going to be in Formula One next year.
So reminder that he stays with Red Bull through the end of the first quarter of 2025 because he's working on the Red Bull hypercar project. So he'll continue to stay with Red Bull for that. So 2025, he might be coming on later in the year. But I think if he stays on the F1 grid, though we don't really know with whom, it'll be primarily for the 2026 cars, which would be interesting. And I think if he ends up at Ferrari, that'll just be nuts. Ferrari is going to turn into a juggernaut between Fred Vasseur, Adrian Newey, Charles Leclerc, and Lewis Hamilton,
Yep.
which would be
Makes me
incredible.
happy.
But without anything else, I think that wraps it up. We will be back midweek again for another Grand Preview episode, previewing another very historic race at another very historic track, the Monaco Grand Prix. But until then, make sure you follow along, and we will see you next time.